Alright, I'm going to get right into it, but this camera is an absolute lifesaver. In today's video, we're going to talk about the Sony FX30 and how it absolutely saved a shoot that we had with NFL star DeAndre Hopkins, and using a feature on this camera that almost nobody's talking about. I'll explain. Now, a week ago, I was getting a bunch of footage for other reviews that I have on this channel, but I did get a text message about a last-minute shoot. Essentially, it was another subscriber, actually, that was congratulating the channel, but also mentioned somebody named Brandon Marshall was going to reach out about my availability for the next day. Me not realizing that that was actually the owner of the I Am Athlete podcast. And essentially what ended up happening was DeAndre Hopkins was in Toronto for a couple of days, and they needed someone to be able to set up a audio, a camera, and just basically have something for their live stream that was going to go on Monday. Now, me having as many cameras as I do have, I said absolutely sure. I have more than enough equipment in order for me to get something set up if you're going to be shooting on live. Now, this is also going to be important to the story, but last week we have something called Victoria Day, which is the third Monday of every single month. Essentially, everything is going to be closed. Everybody's going to be off of work, so if I needed to get any pieces of equipment, you just straight up couldn't. Now, after I got this call, got the location, and got the time, I decided to go into camera prep. Now, what I know about all the new Sony cameras is that in some capacity, you're going to be able to use the camera for live streaming or directly as a webcam. Now, the Sony FX6 might be a little bit of an exception because you are going to need a capture card, which is something that they asked if I had before, but knowing I had other cameras, I said it was fine. Now, this is also my second mistake as well because I also didn't realize that stores are going to be closed the next day. So if I'm in a pinch and I need to get something, I can't get anything. Now, what ends up happening is that after I decided the Sony FX6 wasn't the right tool for the job, I decided to go to some of my smaller camera bodies in the Sony A7 IV, the Sony FX3, and the Sony FX30. Now, the Sony A7 IV sounds like this is going to be a great option. It also sounds like it's going to be a shoo-in in terms of the camera I'm going to shoot my live footage on. However, there's going to be one problem. Now, based on the past, I did have a gig before where my Sony A7 IV actually overheated on me. Twice. I did it when I was actually shooting live using the camera as a webcam, and I didn't want to go down that road again, so I decided to use the FX3 instead. Now, prepping the FX3 with the top panel and everything I need from audio and my lighting, everything seemed to look good when I plugged it into Zoom and I was getting an image on my camera. The new firmware update on the Sony FX3 does allow you to use an app that you can use on your computer to use the FX3 as a web camera. So me thinking everything is okay, I packed everything up, told them I have everything I need to go, and we're also going to be able to shoot in 4K because of Sony FX3 firmware update. This is my second mistake. What ended up happening when we got onto set was I got everything set up and everything was working as it should, except the new app for the Sony FX3 to use it as a webcam does exactly that, but only that. You could only use it as a webcam. It doesn't transmit the audio like you would on the Sony A7 IV because the way that they use the driver is probably a little bit different, and because the firmware update was in the Sony FX3 to enable it as a webcam, it doesn't necessarily work the same way. So now I have great image, but I don't have any audio. And me kind of being stupid didn't decide to bring something like a podcast mic in order for me to have audio just connected separately. Now this is where this camera comes into play, because in terms of using it as a webcam, you get the best of both worlds. One, you're going to be able to not have overheating because it does have a ventilation system built in. And the second thing is that it does still use the same menu system and it still uses the same process as the Sony A7 IV to be used as a webcam. So if I set up the audio top handle for the Sony FX3 on the Sony FX30, I'm still able to get the audio from this camera as my main source of audio whenever I'm live streaming. Now, if I didn't pack this camera, we kind of would have been screwed, and that's exactly what ended up happening. I switched over my kit from the FX3 to the FX30, and we were able to get video and audio at the same time. Somehow we were able to pull everything together and have a successful live stream with the I Am Athlete podcast, and I'll leave a link in the description down below if you guys want to check that out. Now, this all might sound like a bunch of wins and big W's, but there was one problem even though we got the FX30 to actually work with the audio and the video. And that's the idea that I probably should have had a 4K capture card because the Sony FX30 could only transmit in 720p at 30 frames a second while using it as a webcam. Now, for me, generally speaking, I don't really care because I often use it for Zoom calls or just my own podcasts and stuff like that. But when you're on a bigger channel and a bigger podcast, sometimes even when you have better lighting, you're still going to notice some discrepancies in the resolution. We did try using a bunch of techniques in order to make the image look as good as possible, but 4K and 720p are going to look drastically different from each other. So if you do need that higher quality, you might want to consider a capture card for the higher resolutions. However, there's a couple of lessons I learned and a couple of caveats with actually using the FX3 as a webcam that you might want to be aware of. Now, first of all, you want to make sure if you have a gig coming up and it's last minute, make sure you have absolutely everything. Part of the mistake that I had is I thought that stores would be open, so worst case scenario, because it started at noon, I could always pick up something if I ever needed it. However, I totally forgot that Monday was going to be a holiday, and Victoria is kind of a weird holiday to have in Canada anyways, and I didn't realize that I was without a paddle if I needed to get things like a capture card or an Ethernet cable, which were two things that would have come in handy. Now, the second thing that you want to make sure as well is when you're doing a camera prep, don't rush it and think that you know everything about these cameras. I do talk a lot about the FX line of cameras and the odd time the A7 IV. However, if you haven't really tested these guys, you haven't put it through its paces, you might run into a feature that doesn't work the way that you want it to. I knew the Sony FX3 was going to work as a webcam feature, but I didn't know the ways by which how it actually did it. So when I was even setting up, I kind of assumed it was like the A7 IV or the FX30, and it wasn't the case, and that actually might have screwed my audio up if I didn't have a backup. Now, the third thing you want to keep in mind, obviously, is to have a backup camera. A lot of times people talk about having too many cameras or they flame people for having too much camera gear. However, this is a situation where me having literally 3 cameras other to back up to actually came out on top, and I could use the FX30 as my back pocket option or my check down, which is a football term, but don't worry about it. Now, the last thing I learned about this shoot is that you actually never really know who's watching your content. Now, the initial call for this shoot entirely came from another subscriber that was on the channel that didn't even live in Toronto or even Canada for that matter. They reached out, they congratulated the channel, they really liked the stuff that was there, and kept me in mind for a shoot that ever happened in my city, which kind of gives me a little bit of an idea that even though I'm making stuff that might be reviews or practical application, it actually might help get more freelance work. And that's why I think a lot of people that are in the video production space might actually want to consider having things like YouTube or Instagram to post your work. Even though it might be educational, you really never know who's going to be watching, and you really don't know who's going to be giving your next gig to you. That being said, this is a little bit of a story time, me just telling you how things go in video production while using all of these cameras. Oftentimes people think I just review this stuff, but I also tend to do this as well. But using the right tools for the right job is going to be essential with your video production career. And oftentimes it's not the biggest camera that's going to be the one to do that. That being said, if you guys like this video, make sure you comment, like, share, and subscribe. There's going to be way more videos on this channel, but I wanted to tell you how this little guy being the least expensive one was actually the best tool for the job. That being said, see you in the next one. Peace.